Atchafalaya, August. The air above that colossal swamp didn't just hang. It pressed down. It pressed down in a thick, suffocating shroud that seeped into their lungs with every breath, scorching the mucous membranes with a mixture of moisture, the acrid smell of decay, and a characteristic sulfuric odor, hinting at something profoundly wrong and rotten. This scent settled on the tongue with a bitter metallic tang that no amount of water could wash away. Mosquitoes and gnats, countless armies of blood-sucking insects, swarmed in the viscous haze, adding another layer of discomfort to the already unbearable atmosphere. Task Force. Vulture 3 arrived at the very heart of this watery hellscape precisely on schedule. There was no haste, no wasted motion, just cold professionalism honed to absolute perfection, the result of countless hours of training and real-world operations in the planet's most inhospitable corners. From the belly of specially equipped amphibious vehicles, their hulls painted in subdued swamp tones, skittering almost silently across the murky water thick with duckweed and algae. Elite Delta Force operators and specialists from DARPA disembarked onto a floating platform. These amphibians, modified for swamp operations, were more than just transport. They were tracked floating fortresses, fitted with additional reinforced mounts for carrying heavy equipment and powered by robust yet quiet engines capable of overcoming the resistance of the viscous muck and maneuvering among fallen trees and submerged snags. The operators, their faces hidden under matte black ballistic helmets and darkened visors, moved with perfect, almost unnerving synchronicity. Every step, every movement was calculated. Their gear differed from standard Army issue. Light but strong plate carriers with ceramic plates hung on their shoulders, their uniforms, sewn from advanced, quick-drying materials, were designed for extreme humidity and heat. The weapons in their hands, modified assault rifles with underslung grenade launchers and compact, lethal submachine guns, didn't look new or for show. They bore the marks of active use, were functional, battle-tested, and perfectly fitted to each operator. Beside them, bulky, hardened cases containing advanced SATCOM satellite communication systems, autonomous reconnaissance drones, and portable tactical generators capable of powering a small base were unloaded onto the platform. The team commander, a short, wiry man with an incredibly hard, piercing gaze of gray eyes, whose call sign was Vulture Actual, stood by the ramp, observing the unloading and deployment process. His calmness was not feigned. It was profound, stemming from absolute confidence in his people and his preparation. This calmness was transmitted to his subordinates not through words, but through the atmosphere of unwavering competence he radiated. He indicated equipment placement points with a nod, issuing short, quiet commands that were instantly obeyed. The DARPA specialists, their work clothes less tactical, resembling sturdy khaki field uniforms but also designed for harsh conditions, disembarked next. They were led by the chief biobiologist, Dr. Ellis, a thin, short man in his 50s with graying temples and a constant expression of deep thought on his face. They focused on unloading their equipment instruments that looked both bulky and futuristic. Complex air and water analyzers, highly sensitive seismic and bioelectrical activity sensors, hardened field servers with powerful processors, portable chemical and spectrometric labs. They acted methodically, meticulously checking instructions on tablets and packing lists. Their movements lacked the physical ease of the operators, but were filled with intellectual purpose. The floating platform, a modular metal structure resting on a series of massive pontoons, became the center of their temporary world. The team immediately began deploying the base. The Delta operators created a multi-layered security perimeter. They set up visible sentry points, manned by operators in full combat readiness, and also placed hidden motion sensors, thermal imagers, and acoustic sensors throughout the perimeter, on the water and among the nearest vegetation, all connected to a central observation post. They checked the functionality of the generators, 2 primary and 1 backup, which were to provide uninterrupted power for all systems throughout the mission. Water filtration systems, complex reverse osmosis and chemical purification units were started, slowly but surely turning the murky, microorganism-infested swamp liquid into water, suitable for drinking and domestic needs. A centralized depot for ammunition, provisions, medical supplies, and spare gear was organized. Everything sorted and cataloged with military precision. Separately, in one of the hardened modules, a small but fully equipped medical bay was set up. Every action was performed with astonishing efficiency, without unnecessary words, reflecting years of joint training, real-world combat operations, and absolute trust in each other. The Atchafalaya surrounded them on all sides, a living, breathing, but unfriendly space. Thick, gray Spanish moss hung in dense beards from the low, twisted branches of ancient cypress trees, creating a sense of shaded, claustrophobic space. Beneath the layer of fallen leaves, aquatic plants, and vegetative debris floating on the surface, the murky, almost black water hid its own unexplored life. The sounds of the swamp were a constant, pervasive background, the deafening, monotonous croaking of countless frogs, resembling a choir of mechanical instruments, the insistent buzzing of insects, the distant, barely audible whistle of wind forcing its way through the dense, impenetrable foliage of willow and other trees, and most unsettling, the unexplained rustling and splashing sounds coming from the depth of the thickets that couldn't be attributed to wind or animals. All of it created a sense not just of wild, untamed nature, but of something more tangible hidden and most unpleasantly watching them. The swamp felt like a single living organism, reacting hostilely to this intrusion into its peace. The commander gathered everyone, operators and scientists, for a final briefing in the central, most protected compartment of the platform. Maps of the area, the latest satellite intelligence data, detailed platform schematics, and photographs of the operation area were spread out on a large folding table. The commander spoke calmly, his low, even voice sounding confident and clear, despite the background noise of the operating systems. He reiterated the official version of the operation, intended for the outside world and general knowledge of those not privy to the deepest details. Ecological decontamination after a large-scale leak of an unknown, but highly toxic substance that occurred in the area years ago. Then the tone of his voice changed, becoming more serious, stripped of officialdom. He moved on to the factual, true purpose of their presence here. "We are not here because of a spill," he said, slowly looking around at the tense faces present. "The toxic leak is a cover story. Our real task is to investigate a series of anomalous incidents that have occurred in this area over the past few weeks. incidents that are impossible to explain by natural causes or human actions. We have strong reason to believe they are directly linked to Project MK Naomi, an old project most of you have never heard of. Dr. Ellis, whom the commander invited to speak, added information, his voice more academic, but no less serious and unsettling. Project MK Naomi, he began, adjusting his glasses on his nose. This is a long-closed, deeply classified project that was conducted by one of DARPA's divisions in the 60s and 70s. Officially, it was dedicated to researching bioagents. Unofficially, to creating organisms with enhanced, unnatural abilities. Specifically, their goal was to create bioagents capable of rapid self-regeneration, adaptation to any environment, and possibly affecting the surrounding reality. We have fragmentary information obtained from old, damaged archives that one of the project's subjects, grown here in this swamp, and codenamed Lugaru, might have survived the project's official closure and its liquidation. We believe this subject or its offspring is the cause of these incidents. For you, he looked at the operators, his eyes behind his glasses looking tired. This is essentially a hunt for a very dangerous, unpredictable beast. But we are certain the situation is far, far more complex than just hunting an animal. Looks between the operators and scientists grew more strained. The operators, accustomed to dealing with understandable though deadly threats, people, weapons, tactics, were faced with something unclear, biological, born in a lab but survived in the wild. The scientists, whose tools were intellect and knowledge, now found themselves on the front lines, face to face with a practical, living embodiment of dark pages from their own organization's history. The DARPA specialists didn't waste a minute. Immediately after the briefing, they began deploying and calibrating their equipment. Highly sensitive biosensors were installed at key points on the platform and in several locations on the perimeter, among the nearest trees, scanning the air and water for unusual organic compounds, spores, or pathogens not characteristic of the swamp ecosystem. Spectrometers began analyzing the chemical composition of the soil and water, looking for traces of industrial waste, or more likely, remnants of experimental substances used in Project MK Naomi. Acoustic sensors, designed to capture the slightest vibrations and sounds, recorded the complete soundscape of the swamp, highlighting any anomalous frequencies, patterns, or sounds that couldn't be explained by known fauna. Chemical analyzers continuously took water samples from beneath the platform and soil samples from the banks, running them through complex chromatographs and mass spectrometers. Almost immediately, the instruments began recording the first unsettling readings. Graphs appeared on the monitors with peaks indicating the presence of chemicals whose structure didn't correspond to ordinary industrial pollutants or decomposition products. Bioelectrical activity sensors recorded non-standard signals, powerful and chaotic, that couldn't be explained by the nervous systems of alligators, snakes, or other large animals. Most ominously, in some areas, the instrument showed anomalous deviations in the normal ecosystem. The concentration of microorganisms and insects plummeted. The instruments registered an almost complete absence of life, as if some invisible presence was driving everything away, creating a zone of biological death. These data didn't just confirm the scientists' worst fears. They added terrifying weight to the sinister rumors and folk tales about Lugaru they had heard on the way here. Task Force Vulture 3 consisted of experienced individuals, tested in the harshest conditions. Each of them had passed through a sieve of selection and training that broke ordinary people. Among the operators, the sergeant major stood out, a solid, broad-shouldered man with a face as if carved from granite. His silent presence, his absolute composure, and unwavering determination served as an invisible support for the entire group. He was the embodiment of discipline and endurance. There was the technical specialist with the call sign Spark, responsible for all communication systems, electronics, and sensors, a man whose skills were critically important in this isolated location. There was the team medic, Plaster, and the DARPA field medic, Dr. Ann Riley, who worked in close contact, preparing for the worst. There were reconnaissance operators, light and fast, capable of moving silently and unseen, and assaulters, equipped with heavier weapons and gear ready for direct, brutal confrontation. Particularly noteworthy was Sergeant with the call sign Pike. He spoke less than anyone else, often just listening, his gaze constantly scanning the surroundings, clinging to the smallest details that others simply didn't notice. A barely noticeable ripple on the water, an unusual branch movement, a track on the damp earth. His instinctive understanding of the terrain, his wilderness survival skills, and his ability to read tracks were almost supernatural, legendary even among his hardened comrades. The interaction between the operators was honed to perfection. Each knew his place, his role, his duties, and performed them without hesitation. Trust between them was absolute, based on the knowledge that in a critical situation, a comrade would never fail them. And yet, despite this professionalism, the tension that hung in the swamp air felt increasingly strong. The usual dark humor, which typically helped cope with stress in the face of danger, now sounded strained, insincere. At the edge of the permitted zone, marked by the security perimeter, the team encountered several local residents. These were old fishermen whose faces, dried by sun and wind, bore the mark of years spent living in these harsh places. They were not hostile, rather wary and frightened. They warned about the swamp, their voices deep and hoarse, as if saturated with swamp moisture. They told sinister tales of the Lugaru, not the entity from the archives, but a local folk legend, a swamp spirit or werewolf that hides in the mist, lures people into the bog, and drags them away without a trace, leaving behind only agonizing screams and fear. To the Delta operators, accustomed to tangible, real threats, bullets, explosives, organized resistance, this sounded like old superstitions, relics of the past. But their stories, told in the deepening twilight, accompanied by the eerie sounds of the swamp, added another layer of oppressive atmosphere to the already heavy situation. The DARPA specialists, knowing that Lugaru was the code name for the subject in Project MK Naomi, exchanged worried, foreboding glances. The name, coined by cynical scientists decades ago, seemed to have found its horrifying folk confirmation here among these ancient trees and dark waters. The first night on the platform passed in silence, but this silence lacked peace. The team established duty shifts. Operators patrolled the platform perimeter, constantly checking the security systems. This was routine, standard procedure, intended to create a sense of normality, structure in the chaos of an unknown threat. But beneath the surface of professional calm, there was a distinct physical tension pulsing in the air. The unexplained sounds coming from the absolute darkness of the swamp. The sharp crack of a breaking branch where there was no wind, a loud splash of water, strange, low rustling sounds, as if something large was slowly pushing through the thickets. They tried to attribute these to wild animals, to alligators, large snakes, or wild boars. But logical explanations couldn't completely calm their nerves. Then the first event occurred that was impossible to ignore. Several perimeter sensors, the most sensitive acoustic and biometric sensors installed at distant points, suddenly stopped transmitting data. They simply went silent without apparent reason, without triggering an alarm, as if something or someone had carefully turned them off. Attempts to restart them remotely failed. Simultaneously, night vision cameras installed on the corner towers of the platform, for a few moments, captured fleeting, barely noticeable shadows. These shadows glided along the very edge of the field of view too quickly, too silently to be identified. They didn't resemble animal silhouettes. This was the first clear, unambiguous sense that something was out there, in the darkness of the swamp, and it wasn't just present. It was actively operating. It was watching them, studying them. Morning brought only a slight relief from the night's tension. The stuffy, humid heat returned with the first rays of dawn, bringing with it new waves of blood-sucking insects that attacked exposed skin with frenzy despite the repellents. Several operational teams were formed and moved out from the platform for deeper reconnaissance of the surrounding area. They moved slowly, cautiously. Each step required effort. A foot would sink into thick, sticky mud up to the ankle, or slide on roots covered with greenish slime, hidden under a layer of water. Navigation proved extremely difficult. The dense, impenetrable cover of cypress, willow, and oak trees muffled the GPS signal, making electronic navigation instruments practically useless. They were forced to rely on good old paper maps, a compass, and, most importantly, instinctive track reading on damp soil and the ability to navigate by the sun and stars. Skills many had forgotten in the age of satellite navigation. Movement was conducted in strict tactical order, designed for traversing hostile territory. One operator walked ahead, clearing the path and checking the ground before him with a long pole for quicksand or hidden pits. Two operators moved on the sides, covering the flanks and scanning the surrounding thickets for any activity. The last operator brought up the rear of the group, watching the rear and checking if they had left tracks or were being followed. Communication was limited to hand signals, gestures, touches, minimal sounds, so as not to disturb the unnatural silence that sometimes fell in the depths of the swamp. Moving just 100 yards could take agonizing minutes. Every bush, every fallen trunk, every patch of dense foliage could hide potential danger. Nerves were frayed. The group that included Pike ventured deeper into a section of the swamp marked on DARPA's preliminary maps as the zone with the highest and most anomalous instrument readings the previous day. As they approached, they noticed a sharp, ominous change in the environment. The swamp sounds, which were usually a constant background, were almost completely silenced here. Birds weren't singing. The buzzing of insects came only from afar, as if the swamp's inhabitants were avoiding this place, sensing its wrongness. It seemed as if life itself was retreating from this area. The vegetation looked diseased and mutated. Trees were twisted in the most unnatural ways, their branches breaking at strange angles. Leaves on bushes and trees had an ugly, sickly, yellowish, purplish, or even almost black hue, and underfoot, instead of soft grass, the dried, brittle stems of unknown, monstrous plants crunched. A persistent, sharp, and unpleasant odor hung in the air, which resembled neither ordinary swamp decay, nor oil, nor known chemicals. It was both chemical and organic, causing a dryness in the throat and a slight lingering nausea that wouldn't go away. It was in this area that the DARPA instruments had recorded the highest peaks of anomalous activity and bioelectrical signals the previous day. Inside this dead zone, they began to find clear signs of activity. But these were not human tracks in the usual sense. No imprints of army boot soles, no discarded cigarette butts or spent casings. And they were not animal tracks they were accustomed to seeing in the swamp. No neat prints of deer hooves, no wide tracks of alligators. Instead, they discovered huge, deeply pressed prints in the hard ground, resembling a distorted, monstrously large human foot, but more than 1.5 feet long and about 10 inches wide. These tracks moved purposefully. They were not random. Trees along the way were broken with incredible, unnatural force, not as hurricane winds or falling trunks would break them. They were literally torn from the ground with their roots, or broken in half several meters up, their bark ripped to shreds, as if by colossal claws. They discovered strange, viscous patches on the ground, tree bark, and leaves. The color of these patches varied from gray to dark red, almost black, and they had an unusual, jelly-like consistency. These were remnants that resisted immediate identification. Among the dense thickets, hidden for decades under a layer of moss and vines, they found fragments of old, rusted metal equipment and ruined concrete structures, clearly unrelated to the local infrastructure. These were obvious signs of the abandoned facility linked to Project MK Naomi, mentioned in the briefing remains of labs, enclosures, or administrative buildings, swallowed by the swamp after the project was shut down and forgotten. The accompanying DARPA specialists immediately began preliminary analysis on the spot without waiting to return to the platform. They put on protective gloves, masks, and respirators. They took out portable rapid analyzers, small but sophisticated devices capable of quick chemical and biological analysis. They took soil samples from under the giant tracks, samples of affected vegetation, and with particular care, collected samples of the strange biological patches. The rapid analysis confirmed their worst fears. Instruments showed the presence of unknown chemical compounds, absolutely uncharacteristic of the natural swamp ecosystem. The concentration of unusual organic substances in the samples was abnormally high, indicating the presence of a large biological mass with an extremely unusual metabolism. Dr. Ellis, his face under the protective mask even more thoughtful and now frankly alarmed, began to form hypotheses. He connected the findings to what he knew about the officially stated and actual goals of Project MK Naomi: the creation of creatures with high adaptability, cellular-level regeneration, and possibly resistance to any external factors, including chemical and physical ones. The findings in the swamp were horrifying confirmation of the project's success, or rather, failure. Meanwhile, on the floating platform, another part of the DARPA team, having gained access to encrypted archives via the brought-in hardened data carriers, delved into studying the fragmented, heavily classified data on Project MK Naomi. The information was fragmented, many electronic files were damaged by time or deliberately destroyed, entire sections and reports were missing. But even what could be restored and deciphered sent shivers down their spines. The data contained multiple mentions of the subject that had been assigned the code name Lugaru. There were hints and sparse technical descriptions of its abilities. Phenomenal cellular structure regeneration, exceptional adaptation to any environment, elevated intelligence level comparable to human, non-standard sensory capabilities beyond known biological species, and most alarming repeated mentions of the project's failure, caused by the uncontrolled development of the object and its escape from the containment zone years ago, when the project was urgently shut down. Reading these dry official lines describing a living, intelligent being as an object and a failure left a feeling of icy, otherworldly touch. The information obtained from the deciphered archives and the horrifying findings in the swamp discovered by the search party quickly dispelled any remnants of skepticism that might have still remained among the operators. This was not just an animal, not even an unusually dangerous predator, as they had initially assumed. This was something artificial, the result of dark, unethical experiments conducted decades ago. This creature was endowed with intelligence, exceptional physical abilities, and most terrifyingly, unnatural, almost mystical capabilities. It had survived. It was somewhere here, deep within this swamp, and it was the cause of everything. The Delta Force operators, whose training was designed to counter the most prepared human adversaries. Terrorists, elite soldiers of other countries, felt uncomfortable facing this unknown. This biological threat, this something that went beyond their understanding of war and combat, created an oppressive, all-consuming feeling. Experienced veterans who had been through hell suddenly found themselves face to face with a monster from nightmares, born of science. Jokes, even the most cynical dark humor, could no longer lighten this growing palpable weight that pressed down on everyone. The commander and the sergeant major, jointly analyzing the data received from the DARPA specialists and the search party, immediately began revising the tactics for the upcoming night. Standard observation posts were reinforced. Additional hidden observation points were established at key locations around the platform perimeter and on nearby, accessible patches of dry land. Night vision equipment and thermal imagers were checked, distributed, and calibrated with particular care. The operator with the call sign Miller, known for his incredible composure, absolute reliability, and silent movement skills, was assigned a remote patrol. His area of responsibility was exactly where the DARPA instruments had recorded the most unstable and anomalous readings, in the area of the abandoned MK Naomi facility. This was standard procedure for providing early warning, creating a first echelon of defense. But this time it felt different, more dangerous. The feeling of an approaching, inevitable threat hung in the air, becoming as thick and palpable as the swamp mist that began to curl over the water as darkness fell. The darkness of the Atchafalaya swamp that night was absolute, thick, impenetrable, swallowing all light. Miller moved silently, every step calculated. He stepped over moss-covered tree roots, avoided low-hanging branches, trying not to touch them. His night vision device transformed the surrounding world into ghostly shades of green, revealing the contours of cypress trees, the shimmering ripple on the water, the bizarre silhouettes of swamp vegetation. He was one with his gear, every muscle tense, his breathing controlled to a minimum. In his ear there was a quiet, almost inaudible noise from the radio. Standard routine reports from other patrols or short commands from the platform. He listened attentively, catching the slightest changes in the usual rhythm of communication, any interference or glitches. His gaze constantly scanned the surrounding space, noting any, even the most insignificant, deviations from the norm. A broken branch where it shouldn't have been, an unusual glint of light, a too straight line of shadow. But despite his utmost professionalism, the growing nervousness was felt in every tense muscle of his body, in the instinctive desire to grip his weapon tighter. The swamp at night was full of sounds. The splash of water, the croaking of frogs, the cries of night birds, most of which he could identify. But sometimes an unnatural, absolute ringing silence fell, which was more frightening than any noise. In such moments, his survival instinct screamed of danger, of a predator somewhere nearby, frozen, preparing to strike. Suddenly, in the middle of another radio report from one of the patrols, communication with Miller was cut off. There were no screams of pain, no sounds of struggle, no gunshots, nothing that could in any way indicate the cause of the disappearance. There was only an instant, absolute silence in his communication channel, and then, barely audible through the static, a short, indistinct sound, resembling a low, guttural growl or a hoarse sigh, after which the communication channel went completely silent. Dead. Attempts to call Miller on backup frequencies or through other portable devices yielded no result. The air in his channel remained dead. On the platform where everyone was listening to the radio traffic, a tense, frightening silence fell. Everyone realized what had happened. The team immediately began acting strictly according to the protocol for a missing operator, according to standard operating procedures, honed to automatism. Not a second of hesitation, not a shadow of panic. A quick, quiet check of the near perimeter in the area of Miller's last known location, information about which came from his GPS tracker before it also went silent, was immediately conducted. Perimeter motion sensors and thermal sensors were quickly checked for intrusion or movement within the security zone. The commander and the sergeant major, working as a single organism, immediately organized a QRF, quick reaction force, fully ready to move out at the first command, and mentally began frantically working through action plans for the worst-case scenario. On the operators' faces, despite the cold sweat that beaded under their helmets, there was no panic, only focused, icy determination, professionalism honed over years, allowing them to suppress fear and act rationally in the face of impending disaster. The search party, which included Pike due to his exceptional tracking skills, moved out into the absolute darkness of the swamp, barely illuminated by the narrow beams of tactical flashlights mounted on their weapons and the ghostly green light of their night vision devices. Movement was extremely difficult, even harder than during the day. Each step had to be checked with a probe, risking falling into hidden quicksand or stumbling over submerged snags and roots. The risk of being trapped or ambushed remained high. The enemy, whoever it was, had demonstrated the ability to act stealthily and disappear without a trace. The use of thermal imagers proved largely ineffective. The wet, organic, rich swamp itself emitted heat, creating numerous false signals and making it difficult to detect any anomalies. Shadows from trees and hanging moss in night vision created deceptive, distorted shapes that could appear to be anything. A moving figure, a hidden creature. Tension reached its limit. Every nerve was stretched like a string ready to snap. After some time, the search party reached the area where, according to the last data from the GPS tracker attached to Miller's gear, he was located moments before communication was lost. The place seemed untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches that would indicate a fight, no torn earth, no drag marks that would have remained if someone had been pulled away. This was not just an absence of evidence. It was an unnatural absence, as if something or someone had taken Miller from this place, leaving almost no trace of its presence. But they discovered something more disturbing. On the trunk of a large, ancient cypress tree, about 3 feet from the ground, there was a perfectly even, smooth cut on the bark and moss layer, as if made by a sharp, heated blade or even a laser. It was a horizontal cut about 1 foot long. Neither a person with a knife or machete nor a known animal could have made such a cut. Nearby, on the same trunk, they noticed a thin, barely visible layer of strange, slightly glistening slime, which was quickly absorbed into the porous bark of the tree, disappearing before their eyes. And on the damp ground, slightly away from the trunk, one large, indistinct track was discovered. It resembled a distorted paw with massive claws, but it was so unclear, as if the creature that left it had instantly vanished. The track simply ended, as if the creature had gone. Where? Upwards, into the air? Through the ground? A minimum of traces left a maximum of agonizing questions, and not a single one had an answer. Pike squatted down, carefully examining the track. He had never seen anything like it before. Returning to the platform, the search party immediately reported their findings to the commander and the DARPA specialists. The operators handed over the collected samples, a piece of bark with the mysterious cut, samples of the slime, soil samples from under the strange track. The DARPA specialists, their faces tense, immediately began analysis. Simultaneously, they requested data from all perimeter sensors during the time of Miller's disappearance. Analysis of the sensor data revealed anomalous sharp spikes in biosignals and electromagnetic interference precisely in Miller's patrol area at the moment of communication loss. Moreover, several sensors, including night vision and motion cameras, recorded evidence of a brief, high-energy, localized field that seemed to temporarily blind electronic devices within a certain radius, disrupting their operation and data transmission. This confirmed the terrifying truth. This was not just a kidnapping or animal attack. It was the impact of something with unusual, almost unnatural abilities, capable of affecting technology, hiding, and disappearing without a trace. The team clearly grasped the scale of the threat. The opponent was not just strong, not just stealthy and lethal. It was intelligent. It acted deliberately, strategically. It knew how to act against them. It chose a specific victim, Miller, whose disappearance could cause the most alarm and disrupt coordination. It cut off communication, left minimal traces to complicate the search and analysis. This wasn't a hunt for a wild beast driven by instinct, but a game with a tactically thinking adversary who also happened to be perfectly adapted to this hostile environment, far better than they were. The realization of this fact was a cold shower, The night ended, but no one slept. Everyone remained on high alert, waiting for the enemy's next move, not knowing what it would be or where it would come from. In the morning, search operations resumed with doubled strength and resources. All available means and personnel were deployed. Additional groups of operators moved into the swamp, sweeping every square yard of territory around the platform. Unmanned aerial vehicles were launched, equipped with highly sensitive thermal imagers and high-resolution cameras, scanning a vast area from above, trying to detect any signs of activity or unusual objects, despite the difficult terrain and thick forest cover, which severely hindered visibility. Miller was found, but not where they expected to find him. Not on the platform, where he should have returned, and not in the water, where he might have been dumped after an attack. He was found on a small, barely noticeable dry hummock in the middle of the swamp, relatively far from the platform and from the site of his disappearance, away from any traveled paths. The location seemed deliberately chosen, as if it wasn't a random stopping or hiding place, but some kind of message left for those who would find him. The scene they discovered was horrifying, beyond human comprehension of cruelty and pain. Miller was alive. His heart, according to the field medic's readings, was beating wildly, but his body was mutilated in a way that no known predator or human torture could achieve. The details of the injuries seemed deliberate, methodical, as if something or someone was conducting a monstrous experiment on him. His eyes were either gouged out or burned. Their place was bloody, gaping cavities. His tongue was neatly removed as if cut out with surgical, sinister precision. His fingers and toenails were torn off to the quick, as if he had clawed at the ground, mud, or metal in a desperate, agonizing attempt to break free, hide, or simply end the unbearable pain. His clothes were torn to shreds, but the nature of the damage didn't resemble ordinary bites or scratches from a wild animal. It was a combination of monstrous, tearing force and something subtle, malevolent, almost sadistic. The team medic, Plaster, and the DARPA field medic, Dr. Ann Riley, despite the shock of what they saw, which they tried to hide behind a mask of professionalism, immediately began a preliminary examination on the spot. They worked quickly, trying to assess Miller's condition and provide some aid. Miller's vital signs were beyond any norm. His pulse was abnormally strong and fast. The blood oozing from the wounds seemed almost black, thick. His breathing was strange, rattling, interrupted, unnatural. His body temperature was significantly, dangerously elevated. Yet he was in a deep, impenetrable coma, not responding to any external stimuli. Pain, light, sound. And then the medics noticed the first physical changes, happening right before their eyes, with horror. Something was clearly moving under the skin on his limbs and body, causing deformation of muscles and changes in bone contours. His skin was acquiring a strange, sickly grayish-purple hue, in places covered with ugly, swollen patches. Dr. Riley quietly, almost whispering, said, These aren't wounds. This is transformation." Miller was taken back to the platform in critical condition. Realizing the potential horrifying threat emanating from his state and the changes occurring in him, the commander made a difficult but necessary decision. Miller was completely isolated in the medical bay, which had been initially equipped to handle particularly dangerous biological threats. Maximum bio-containment protocols were activated, The bay doors were hermetically sealed, ventilation shut off, access permitted only in full Level 4 protective gear. This decision weighed heavily morally on everyone, especially on the operators who had known Miller for years, who had shared barracks, foxholes, risks, and combat brotherhood with him. Strapping his lifeless but changing, suffering body to the medical cot became a terrible but necessary precaution. In the sterile, isolated atmosphere of the medical bay, DARPA specialists worked at a frantic pace on in-depth analysis of the samples taken from Miller blood, tissues, saliva, slime samples from his skin. The results were not just shocking, they caused panic, cold horror. They discovered an unknown pathogen, a complex non-cellular structure with an abnormally complex genetic sequence. This structure contained sequences that did not match the human genetic code, nor were they similar to the genetics of known animals, even the most exotic. Upon further accelerated analysis, markers were found that completely matched data fragments found the previous day in the MK Naomi Project archives. This was not just a disease, not a virus or bacteria in the usual sense. It was a direct transmission of genetic material, entire blocks of foreign modified DNA, the beginning of a rapid, unnatural transformation of the human organism. Dr. Ellis, working side by side with Dr. Riley, his face ashen, confirmed the worst. This was not an infection in the usual sense. It was reprogramming the organism, using it as a building platform for growing a new creature, a new Lugaru. Right before the eyes of the medic and scientists observing him through the protective glass, Miller began to change with frightening, uncontrollable speed. The musculature on his limbs and body grew uncontrollably, tearing his skin and deforming his former human shape. Bones under the skin bent and thickened, causing painful, low gasping and gurgling sounds that escaped from his mouth, despite the absence of his tongue. He made low, inhuman sounds, resembling neither groans of pain, nor speech, nor animal growls. His eyes, even mutilated, showed anomalous activity, their color changing, acquiring an unnatural, predatory, glowing hue in the semi-darkness of the bay. Consciousness seemed to have completely left him, leaving only pure animal instinct and something much worse. A frightening, aggressive, alien presence that looked at them from eyes that were recently their comrades. The realization that the creature not only killed but could create its own kind, turning victims into monsters, doubled the horror of the situation. The threat acquired a new, terrifying dimension. In the laboratory on the floating platform, Dr. Ellis and his team, or rather, what was left of it after the search parties left, worked non-stop, at the limit of human strength and nerves. Their faces were pale with fatigue, tension, and horror. They were trying to understand the mechanism of infection and the rapid transformation that was happening to Miller. For hours they compared the genetic code of the discovered pathogen with fragments of data from the MK Naomi archives. Their initial, most terrifying hypothesis was confirmed with frightening, chilling accuracy. The creature, the carrier of this anomalous genetic material, transmitted part of its modified genetics to the victim, using its body as a living building platform for growing a new specimen, a new form of itself. This explained the incredible speed of the transformation, its unpredictable nature, and the unnatural, monstrous physical changes observed in Miller. This was not just infection, but a form of biological replication, reproduction, based on monstrous, out-of-control genetic engineering. The DARPA specialists faced a terrible, sobering truth that hit harder than any bullet. The threat they encountered was a direct result of experiments conducted by their own organization, or a related structure which had carried out dark, unethical research in bioengineering and genetics in the past. A feeling of guilt, responsibility, and deep moral shock overwhelmed them. They were scientists. Their goal was knowledge, progress, improving life. But now they had to deal with a living, suffering example of where science could lead without control, without ethical limitations, without understanding the consequences. Fear of the creature mingled with fear of the consequences of human error, which had now taken tangible, deadly form and looked at them from the eyes of their dying comrade. Studying the creature's abilities based on data collected in the swamp, giant tracks, nature of tree damage, composition of biological patches, events with Miller, method of communication cutoff, anomalous signals, nature of injuries and transformation, and fragmentary data from the MK Naomi archives allowed the team to piece together a more complete but no less horrifying profile of the Lugaru. Its regeneration was not just fast, it was phenomenal, capable of restoring damaged tissues and even entire limbs literally before their eyes. The creature's strength was incredible, allowing it to break ancient trees, rip them out by the roots, and pierce the operator's protective gear designed for bullet impacts. Its stealth and intelligence were astonishing. It acted deliberately, avoided detection, used the environment to its advantage. And most inexplicable, its ability to affect electronics, blind sensors, and disrupt communication suggested the presence of some powerful bioelectrical field or other physical effect beyond their current scientific understanding. With each new fact, with each piece of information gathered, a terrible realization grew. The ordinary weapons they were used to relying on, their rifles, machine guns, grenades, all of it proved almost useless against it. The team desperately tried to transmit all the acquired information upwards to HQ, to Central Command. They tried to communicate via SATCOM channels using the most powerful transmitters to report Miller's death, officially until the moment of transformation. The nature of the threat, not an animal but a bioengineered creature capable of infection and transforming victims. But communication was unstable, constantly interrupted. The signal was weak and distorted. It seemed the creature's activity, its ability to affect electronics, combined with the platform's remoteness, deep in the swamp and the dense forest cover, created impassable interference for radio waves. They were only able to transmit fragments of information, single words, disjointed phrases, utterly insufficient for HQ to adequately assess the scale of the catastrophe, understand the true nature of the threat, and send necessary aid or take appropriate measures. They found themselves completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in the swamp with the monster they themselves had helped discover. Among the operators, already in a state of extreme tension, a new corrosive feeling quickly grew: paranoia. The horror of what they had seen with Miller, the understanding that the creature could transmit its essence, turning people into something monstrous, generated a sharp, all-consuming fear of infection. Who would be next? What was the mechanism of transmission? Could it happen through the air they breathed? Through the water they filtered, but which surrounded them on all sides? Any scratch from a branch, any contact of swamp water with exposed skin caused sharp, persistent fear, prompting immediate disinfection of the wound and examining themselves for any, even the slightest changes. Trust in the environment, even the air they breathed, was completely undermined. The swamp transformed not just into a location, an arena of operations, but into a symbol of a pervasive, invisible biological threat that could lurk anywhere at any moment. The commander and the sergeant major, working together, immediately revised the platform's defensive tactics based on the data received about the creature's capabilities. They understood that standard defense wouldn't work. They installed additional traps around the perimeter, on land, and in the water around the pontoons. Approaches to the platform from the water, which seemed the most likely direction for a creature's stealthy infiltration, were mined with anti-personnel mines, sensitive to pressure and movement. They prepared to use the more powerful assets available on the platform: heavy-caliber sniper rifles, .300 Win Mag, and .338 Lapua, that could inflict enough damage to at least temporarily slow the creature. Automatic grenade launchers with fragmentation and high-explosive rounds, shotguns with reinforced, non-lethal and lethal shells. They understood that the coming attack would not be conventional. Standard tactics against a human opponent would not work. Meanwhile, the creature itself, the Lugaru, was somewhere in the vicinity of the platform. It wasn't idle. It was observing. Its high intelligence allowed it to analyze the team's actions, their defensive preparations, their reaction to the loss of Miller, their desperate but unsuccessful attempts to contact the outside world. It studied their weaknesses, their protocols, their behavior under stress. It used the natural sounds of the swamp, the croaking of frogs, the rustling in the reeds, the splashing of water, to mask its own movements, making itself practically inaudible even to highly sensitive acoustic sensors. At times, it made sounds imitating bird calls, or even distant human voices to confuse them, to sow uncertainty and fear. The creature was planning its next move, considering everything it had learned about its opponents. This was not just an attack, but a calculated tactical operation by a predator. The attack began not with a massive frontal assault, as might be expected from a less intelligent opponent. It was smart, calculated, and tactical, aimed at undermining the team's ability to resist and coordinate. First, the creature disabled key life support and defense systems of the platform. There was a dull thud underwater, then a sharp crack, and the main generator, which powered the platform, went silent, plunging everything into absolute pitch-black darkness. Emergency lighting, powered by batteries, came on after a few seconds, illuminating the space with a ghostly, weak light. But the operators were now largely dependent on their night vision devices, against which the creature, as they had already realized, was skilled at masking itself. Then followed a series of short, sharp power surges and powerful electromagnetic interference, and the communication systems, including backups, failed. They were completely cut off from the outside world. The creature actively used the swamp environment itself as a weapon. It raised waves, striking the platform's pontoons from below, churned the water beneath the operator's feet, created loud, distracting noises in one place to draw attention away from its true direction. This disrupted coordination between the operators, sowing chaos and panic. Penetration occurred with frightening, disheartening ease. Despite the installed traps, mined approaches, and around-the-clock surveillance, the creature either breached or, more likely, bypassed the perimeter, using its incredible stealth and ability to transform its body, compressing or contorting to fit through narrow openings, or using monstrous strength to bend steel railings. It emerged from the water silently, its skin covered in swamp mud and algae, blended with the environment, making it practically invisible even to thermal imagers, which only reacted to its abnormally high body temperature, which it perhaps could control. First contact was close quarters, sudden, and exceptionally brutal. The creature didn't shoot them from a distance or use any known combat tactics. It rapidly closed the distance, emerging from the darkness or water, and attacked hand to hand, relying on its physical power and the weapon that was its own altered flesh. Its claws, sharp as razors and strong as steel, easily pierced even specialized plate carriers, tearing ceramic protective plates and the flesh beneath them. It threw operators with immense force, like rag dolls, broke bones with a single blow of a massive limb. The operators tried to use the hand-to-hand combat techniques they had been taught for years, but they faced inhuman strength, speed, and flexibility against which their honed training was powerless. The operators opened a torrent of instinctive fire from their assault rifles and machine guns, shooting into the darkness at sound, at movement barely caught by night vision devices, or at a silhouette that appeared and instantly vanished. Bullets, standard 5.56 and 7.62 rounds, entered the creature's body, leaving bloody holes, but didn't stop it. The creature continued to move as if feeling no pain or ignoring it. In moments when it slowed down, they saw with horror in the light of tactical flashlights or NVDs how it pulled bullets from its wounds, and the damaged tissues healed before their eyes as a wound closed with a film. This sight caused shock and despair. Their primary weapon proved almost useless. Only hits from heavy-caliber rifles, .300 Win Mag, .338 Lapua, to the head or spinal area could temporarily slow it, knock it back with a deafening impact, cause a brief pain shock, but even these terrible wounds began to heal almost immediately, not taking the creature out of the fight for long. The creature wasn't just killing blindly in a fit of rage. It methodically chose targets, demonstrating frightening, malevolent intelligence. It attacked the medic, Plaster, attempting to deprive the team of the ability to provide aid to the wounded. It attacked the comms specialist, Spark, to cut off any, albeit unsuccessful, attempts to restore contact with the outside world. It deliberately attacked the commander, Vulture Actual, trying to decapitate the group, deprive them of leadership and coordination. The DARPA scientists also became targets. Their knowledge posed a threat to the creature, or they were simply excess witnesses who needed to be eliminated. Protecting key personnel became a priority, but under conditions of chaos and unimaginable enemy power, it was an almost impossible task. Despite all their preparation, discipline, and courage. Task Force. Vulture 3 was not ready for such an opponent. The fight quickly turned into a bloody, desperate meat grinder in the confined space of the platform. The platform filled with cries of pain and fear, the creature's low, guttural roar, the clatter of gunfire, the whipping splash of water, the groans of the wounded. Sensory overload was complete. Coordination broke down. Groups of operators were cut off from each other, fighting for their lives in scattered pockets of resistance. The professionalism of the Delta operators allowed them to last longer than ordinary soldiers. Their skills enabled them to inflict damage where possible, use any cover. But they were inexorably depleted under the pressure of inhuman force, speed, and unstoppable regeneration. The scientists, lacking combat training, found themselves in the thick of the carnage, desperately trying to help, using their knowledge and improvised means. Dr. Ellis, sheltering behind an overturned metal table, shouted advice to the operators based on his emergency analysis of the creature's genetic structure from the MK Naomi archives. It has a weak spot where the brainstem would be. Aim for the base of the skull. The tissue density is lower there. Other DARPA specialists tried to use the chemicals or equipment they had as improvised weapons, pouring unknown corrosive substances from flasks onto the creature, or attempting to use electrical discharge devices. One scientist died trying to protect the servers containing critically important data about Project MK Naomi and the current analyses of samples taken from Miller and in the swamp. Their scientific knowledge became the last fragile chance to find some vulnerability in a creature that seemed to have no weak points. The clash reached its peak on the platform itself. The fight unfolded in tight quarters, among overturned equipment, broken crates, and pools of blood. Operators fought back to back, using any debris as temporary cover. The description of the fight, as remembered by the few survivors, conveyed what was happening through the eyes of different participants, showing how their individual skills and characteristics manifested in the encounter with the inhuman threat. Pike, using his natural stealth and instinctive knowledge of the terrain, even limited to the platform, maneuvered in the shadows, sliding between debris, flanking the creature, trying to strike from unexpected places, using his knife in close combat or short bursts from his submachine gun at critical points Dr. Ellis had mentioned. They used the heavy caliber rifles, .300 Win Mag and .338 Lapua, the most powerful kinetic weapons they had. Hits from these rifles at close range could stop the creature for a few seconds, throw it back with a deafening impact, cause temporary pain shock. But it was only a brief respite. Within moments, the wounds began to heal, and the creature lunged back into the fight as if only slightly slowed down. The regeneration was relentless, horrifying. The operators made desperate attempts to use explosives and fire. They threw fragmentation grenades, which threw the creature back with their blast wave, and flashbangs, which temporarily disoriented it, causing blindness and ringing in its ears. They used incendiary devices, Molotov cocktails, trying to set it on fire. Fire inflicted visible damage, scorching flesh and slowing movement. But regeneration handled even this, leaving perhaps ugly scars on the creature's body, but not taking it out of the fight for long. These means bought only moments, barely enough to change position, reload a weapon, or drag a wounded comrade to cover. The death of comrades was horrifying, unimaginably brutal. When the creature caught one of the operators or scientists, it didn't kill quickly. It broke bones with a sickening crunch, tore flesh with its claws, and teeth with incredible, icy, calculated cruelty. These were agonizing, terrible deaths that hit the survivor's psyche harder than any of their own injuries. To see your friends die, to see their bodies turn into mutilated, bloody remains, it was something no training, even the most rigorous, could have prepared them for. The sergeant major died in a heroic but ultimately futile attempt to cover the retreat of a small group of operators and scientists to the central, most protected compartment. He met the creature face to face, trying to buy a few precious seconds, and his end was swift and terrible. In the very midst of the carnage, when defenses were pushed to the limit and all the survivors' attention was focused on repelling the main Lugaru's attacks, something unforeseen happened. The final blow. The transforming Miller, having already completed his monstrous metamorphosis into a crude, primitive, but incredibly strong copy of the creature, broke out of the medical bay. His body had become a grotesque, nightmarish parody of human form. Hypertrophied, knotty musculature, deformed limbs with sharp claws, gaping, absent eyes filled only with blind rage. He attacked everyone indiscriminately, both the surviving operators and the main creature, driven likely by pure animal instinct and perhaps the unbearable pain his changing body was experiencing. This added chaos to the already uncontrollable situation and forced the few survivors to defend themselves against two threats simultaneously, one of which had once been their comrade, their friend. The moral horror of having to shoot at what remained of Miller left a heavy, indelible burden on the survivor's psyche. The DARPA scientists found themselves in direct mortal danger. The main creature, and possibly the transformed Miller, attacked them directly, seeing them as a threat due to their knowledge, or simply easy prey. They also became victims of the platform's structures collapsing, damaged during the fight and explosions. Dr. Ellis, the only one left from his group, desperately tried to use some of his scientific equipment or tissue samples of the creature he had managed to collect as improvised weapons or means of defense, pouring unknown chemicals from flasks onto the creature or attempting to use electrical discharge devices from instruments. He fought not as a soldier, but as a scientist trying to find a solution, even in the face of death. At the height of the battle, when most of the team was killed or severely wounded, when the floating platform had turned into smoking, blood-soaked ruins, the creature suddenly retreated. It wasn't a panicked flight under pressure from fire. It was a calculated, tactical withdrawal. It had achieved its goals, destroyed most of the trained team, eliminated the threat posed by the scientists, and obtained material, the bodies of the dead, which could be used for further proliferation, for creating new specimens. Perhaps it had sustained damage that, despite phenomenal regeneration, required time for full recovery. It left as silently as it came, disappearing into the darkness and chaos of the swamp, leaving behind destruction, death, and a dead ringing silence that fell immediately after the fighting ceased. Above the ruined floating platform, the dawn of a new day slowly rose. The soft, golden light of the sun illuminated a scene of absolute chaos, destruction, and slaughter. The metal structures of the platform were twisted, broken, scattered, and broken equipment lay everywhere. Crates, instruments, weapons, the operator's personal belongings. The deck was covered in a thick layer of blood, mud, and fragments of what were once human bodies. Everything testified to the unimaginable horror of the past night. The dead, unnatural silence that fell after the fighting ceased contrasted sharply with the memory of the noise, screams, and roars that had recently shaken the air. The swamp around seemed utterly indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred, its murky waters quietly lapping against the damaged pontoons as if nothing had happened. Pike, exhausted to the limit, with a deep, jagged wound on his arm from the creature's claw, a severe concussion from a nearby explosion, and countless minor cuts and bruises, slowly surveyed the battlefield, limping among the debris. The shock of what he had endured, of the atrocities he had witnessed, weighed him down like a heavy physical burden, as if the swamp air itself were pressing down. He found himself the sole survivor of the Delta Force operators. He recognized the faces of the few whose bodies were relatively intact, but most of his comrades were dead, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition or simply gone, carried away by the creature into the depths of the swamp for unknown, horrifying purposes. The DARPA specialists had also perished. Their laboratory was a heap of broken glass, twisted metal, and inoperable electronics. Checking the ruins, driven by his last reserves of strength and a sense of duty, Pike discovered that the transformed Miller, despite the damage sustained during the fight with the main creature and possibly from the operator's fire, was still alive and moving. This was no longer his friend, his comrade. It was a monster, perhaps a less perfect and more primitive form than the Loup-garou, wild, aggressive, driven only by basic instincts and the pain of transformation, but still deadly dangerous and posing a threat of spread. It was on the platform, representing an immediate danger. Pike was forced into a final, short, brutal, and deeply personal fight with what remained of his comrade. It was a struggle full of internal conflict and pain. The necessity of killing a friend, transformed into a monster, for his own survival, and far more importantly, to prevent the spread of this biological threat, became one of the hardest moments of his life. Pike used his remaining strength, all his fury, and all his skills to neutralize and definitively destroy the transformed Miller. Having finished this terrible, necessary task, Pike checked the general state of the platform. The generator systems were destroyed, the fuel, provision, and ammunition stores were scattered, soaked with water and mud, and largely unusable. There was no communication with the outside world. Transmitters were smashed, antennas broken, electronics disabled. Evacuation seemed impossible. The creature, the Loup-garou, was somewhere nearby, possibly wounded after the fight, but clearly not killed, and could return at any moment. The threat of infection emanating from blood, tissues, and remains hadn't disappeared. Pike, looking at the destroyed base and the bodies of his comrades, understood that there was no rescue. The mission had failed, but the threat had to be contained. In the ruins of the DARPA laboratory, among the debris of scientific equipment, broken monitors, and scattered papers, Pike found an intact data carrier, Dr. Ellis's protected laptop, which he had tried to shield. The laptop was externally damaged, but the hard drive remained intact. Connecting it to a portable reading device, Pike discovered the scientist's last notes and analyses, confirmation of the true nature of the threat, its direct and undeniable link to Project MK Naomi, detailed, though incomplete data on the creature's phenomenal regeneration, its intelligence, and, most importantly, its ability to infect and transform victims. This was information that revealed the full, terrible truth. Information that should not fall into the wrong hands and should not become public knowledge so as not to cause worldwide panic and prevent anyone from using this bioengineered technology for their own purposes. Faced with the absolute utter hopelessness of his situation and realizing the true scale of the threat, not just the creature itself, but its potential for uncontrolled spread through transformation, Pike made the only possible, the only right decision. This decision was dictated by his professional principles, his oath, and knowledge of the most classified protocols in case of catastrophe. The mission of containment and non-proliferation of this bioengineered threat proved more important than his own life. He knew about the Dead Hand Emergency Protocol, a plan to destroy the operation zone by external forces in case of uncontrolled contamination or complete mission failure. He had to activate it. Pike, despite the deep jagged wound, concussion, general exhaustion, and unbearable pain, began methodically searching the remnants of the floating platform. His target was the emergency satellite transmitter, the only device capable of sending a coded signal through the swamp's interference and activating the Dead Hand Protocol. It was a specially protected device, designed to survive in the most extreme conditions, and it seemed to have withstood the creature's attack and the platform's destruction. Pike searched through metal debris, among scattered gear, under overturned tables, among the bodies of his fallen comrades, trying not to look at the horrifying scene around him. Each step, each bend caused sharp pain, but he continued, driven by one clear purpose. Finding the transmitter, attached to the underside of one of the relatively intact compartments of the platform, Pike proceeded to activate it. The process required entering a series of authorization codes, the last of which was a special master code known only to the commander or the sergeant major. Pike knew where the sergeant major, always meticulous, kept his personal belongings and official notes. He found the code in his soaked, bloody notebook that lay near the sergeant major's body. Each digit he entered on the transmitter's membrane keypad became a step towards self-destruction, towards the end of everything. It was an act of respect for his fallen commander, and a demonstration of deep, silent grief, using his last secret to fulfill their common final mission. Before sending the signal, Pike made sure all remaining data on the platform was destroyed. He returned to the ruins of the DARPA laboratory and used an incendiary mix from the medical kit to set fire to all surviving papers and documents related to the project and the operation. Then he physically smashed with a hammer all hard drives, data carriers, and any electronic devices that might contain data about Project MK Naomi, the creature, or what had happened. This became his final act of fulfilling the core mission, to hide the truth and prevent the spread of information and the threat. He also ensured the definitive destruction of the transformed Miller, knowing that ordinary bullets might be insufficient against his regeneration. He used the most reliable method he knew, understanding that this was the final act of farewell to a comrade, his last mercy and self-preservation. Finding a relatively intact, stable section of the deck, Pike connected the transmitter. With wet, trembling fingers, he aimed the short antenna towards the supposed position of the satellite in the pre-dawn sky, and sent the coded signal. The signal went into the darkness, towards the waiting satellite. In that moment, Pike realized there was no turning back. He pressed the activation button for the Dead Hand Protocol. He had completed his task. Pike found a relatively safe spot in the remnants of the platform's metal structure, a niche that could provide minimal protection from the blast wave if the epicenter wasn't directly over him. There he sat, leaning his back against the cold, bent metal, waiting for the impact. Time seemed to stop, slowing down to infinity. He reflected, remembering the faces of his comrades, their jokes during long flights, their professionalism in battle. He thought about his life, about what they had done, about what would happen now to him, to this place, to everything they had found. This became his last act of courage, to face the end. Knowing he had done everything he could to prevent the threat from spreading, to prevent the world from learning about the horror born in a lab and grown in a swamp. Meanwhile, in the highest echelons of power, in a sterile high-tech command center thousands of miles away, the signal from Vulture 3 was received. The code was confirmed: Dead Hand. The system automatically identified the sender and the protocol. Analysts instantly calculated the coordinates of the signal source. A short, unemotional order was issued to strike the indicated points, according to the Dead Hand Protocol. Somewhere high in the sky, a strategic bomber on combat duty changed course. It carried a powerful thermobaric warhead, capable of destroying all life and most material objects within a vast radius, burning out oxygen and leaving behind only destruction. At the highest level, they demonstrated the cold, unemotional side of making such decisions: numbers, protocols, coordinates on a map. The human lives on the platform were already statistics, variables in the equation of threat containment. The impact was of unimaginable, apocalyptic force. The explosion of the powerful thermobaric warhead incinerated the air within hundreds of yards, creating an instant vacuum, then a colossal fireball, and finally, a devastating overpressure wave that swept away everything in its path. Everything at the epicenter was annihilated in an instant. The water in the swamp boiled, turning into a giant cloud of superheated steam. Nearby trees were not just broken. They were uprooted, shredded, their trunks and branches thrown vast distances like light straws. The floating platform, which an hour ago had been a field of brutal combat, turned into a heap of twisted, smoking metal debris scattered across the surface of the water and mud. A giant cloud of steam, water, mud, vegetative debris, and dust rose hundreds of feet above the swamp, creating an eerie, mushroom-shaped column visible for dozens of miles. High above the ground, a spy satellite specifically targeted at this zone after the protocol activation recorded the impact site. Sensitive cameras and sensors impassively recorded what was happening. The bright flash, the spread of the shock wave, the formation of the cloud. Clear footage of the explosion, its thermal signature and cloud formation were instantly transmitted to the analysis center. The system automatically processed the data, comparing it to the expected results of the protocol activation. Confirmation came quickly in dry lines of text on the monitor. Target destroyed and operation completed according to the Dead Hand Protocol. Reports went up the chain of command, dry, technical, and unemotional. Vulture 3 down. Objective achieved. Zone cleared. The government acted quickly and decisively to control the narrative, to ensure the truth never got out. An official version of events was presented to the press and public. They announced a large-scale environmental disaster in the Atchafalaya swamp resulting from a leak of highly toxic waste from a secret facility years ago. They reported the heroic deaths of a group of specialists, operators, and scientists involved in mitigating the consequences of this leak and saving the region's ecology. The area was declared closed to access for decades under the pretext of decontamination and cleanup efforts. All material evidence, remains of the platform, bodies of the deceased, fragments of equipment, were destroyed during the strike or quickly recovered and concealed. The truth about the bioengineered project MK Naomi and the creature it created was buried under a layer of official lies, under thousands of tons of swamp mud and water, under the fear of the unknown. A week later, when the giant cloud of steam and dust had dissipated, and the water at the impact epicenter had settled somewhat, the same satellite took a new photo of the affected zone. It showed a huge, irregularly shaped crater filled with murky brown water, the platform's ruins scattered for hundreds of yards across the swamp, a burned and scattered landscape around it. It seemed nothing living could have survived at the epicenter of such an impact. The swamp gradually began to heal the wound inflicted. Water returned to the crater. Plants again reached for the light at the periphery, but the central zone still looked dead, a horrifying scar on the body of nature. However, a satellite analyst, specifically assigned to constantly monitor the impact zone, noticed something strange in the high-resolution image. It was a faint, indistinct thermal signature that seemed to be moving near the periphery of the crater. Zooming in to maximum resolution, he saw a blurred silhouette. Something vertical, bipedal, located at the very edge of the impact zone, but clearly within it, among the debris and scorched trunks. It was not the thermal signature of a bird in flight or an alligator basking on a log. It shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have existed. The creature, the Lugaru, had survived. Its phenomenal regeneration and ability to adapt had perhaps allowed it to withstand even such an impact, being at the very periphery of the blast zone. Or perhaps its high intelligence had allowed it to anticipate the danger and find sufficiently deep cover or use tactics that enabled it to avoid the direct impact of the thermobaric explosion's epicenter. The creature stood among the ruins of what had once been its enemy's base, and seemed to look into the sky, as if knowing that those who had tried to destroy it were still watching.